Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for making it here, both getting out of bed and deciding that we're a preferable alternative to some of the other very good sessions that are going on in parallel. So, my name's Joseph Heenan. I'm the CTO at Authlete, but actually I wear quite a few different hats. So, a lot of my experience today that I'm going to be talking about is because I also work with the OpenID Foundation, leading their certification program that's been involved in all sorts of open banking ecosystems, and as you can tell from my accent, probably, I'm from the UK, who are one of the bigger, longer open banking ecosystems, and I'm one of those outlying people that over the last 5 years I've used about 30 different bank accounts or something, so I have actually seen open banking and all the good and bad things from the end user perspective, and we're going to talk about some of that.
And I'm Dima Postnikov. I come here from Australia. I have been involved with a couple of large implementations of open banking with two largest banks in Australia, and I'm also doing quite a bit of work with OpenID Foundation on trying to push the standards agenda. And now I'm building an identity network in Australia as well. And I also have probably most of the bank accounts in Australia as well, just for testing purposes.
Yeah, so we'll start by answering the slightly rhetorical question we asked, which is open banking actually benefiting fintechs, banks and end users? Yes, but it almost didn't, and that's a bit of what we're going to talk about today. So a reminder about the before open banking times, and for many of you that are in the US, this is probably still where you are today, which is screen scraping. Probably most of you have already heard about this, but just to set the context for open banking, we have to think about screen scraping first. Screen scraping was mostly good for end users. It was widely used for account aggregation. There weren't really many barriers to getting it working at any particular bank because you don't need the bank's consent to do screen scraping. And it was generally a one-off setup for users because they give their username and password for their bank account to the third party, and because most users never change their password, that just works forever. So that was good for users. But screen scraping is really weird for banks. You get these really weird, unpredictable peaks in usage of online banking portals because, you know, comes 4 a.m, all the account aggregators decide to hit all your endpoints for all their users at the one time, and you get these weird peaks at 4 a.m. that you have to try and scale to counter, which it's inefficient, and hence you're loading costs onto banks, and because screen scraping doesn't involve any contractual relationship with the bank, there's not much the banks can do to influence it. And these kind of things also end up triggering the bank's fraud systems, because you've got, you know, thousands of users suddenly accessing your systems at 4 a.m. from one IP address. Not exactly expected traffic. Banks probably can't block it or won't, because users rely on these services. If banks start to actually try and block screen scraping, they're going to get the attention of regulators fairly quickly, because it's potentially anti-competitive behaviour, because many of the people that are doing screen scraping are also competing with the banks. So blocking their access to data isn't likely to go down well. Screen scraping also prevents banks rolling out multi-factor authentication, which banks need to up their security game, because we've seen the amount of phishing and so on we've seen over the last 5 years. You just have to have better authentication than just a username and password. And as I said, there's no contracts or rules in place, so the banks can do very little to influence the screen scrapers in a lot of cases. And users, some banks tried to tell users, hey, just don't share your passwords, please. But if you're not offering any alternative ways for users to get these kinds of services, then users aren't going to listen to you. You know, convenience trumps security almost always.
Screen scraping, it was solving a real business problem, trying to automate people's life, automate transfer of information between the banks. So that's why it was there. I was working for a bank that was trying to make their users a little bit more security conscious, telling them that your account has been accessed by a robot overnight, and it has got a bit of pushback from Fintechs and Fintech Association in Australia that quite publicly, which is kind of creating a problem for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, nothing quite panics your banking users like 4,000 of them getting an SMS at 4 a.m. to say somebody's trying to access your bank account. And yeah, there are still a few cases where screen scraping is used in the UK, and I have had that 4 a.m. phone call and thought somebody was actually trying to hack my bank account, but it was just, yeah, I'd forgotten I'd given my username and password to a screen scraper a year ago, and suddenly the bank decided that was the day it was going to trigger their fraud system. Where are we? So, yeah, screen scraping was bad for security. Giving third parties your credentials is a bad idea, because especially when you're just trying to get account aggregation, just give people access to your transaction data, you do not want to be giving them unlimited access to make payments out of your bank account. And the liability model around all that is completely unclear in most jurisdictions, which is not good for users if unexpected payments do actually happen. And screen scraping is expensive for the actual fintechs, the people trying to access the data. Anytime the bank tweaks their banking portal, you risk the stuff stopping working until one of the developers at the fintechs goes in and plays around with their own bank account, sees what's changed and updates their code. So that's not technically a good solution. And as we said, banks probably could potentially block screen scraping, but there's so many reasons why they really can't unless they have an alternative. So that sets the context. Open banking replaces screen scraping. But whilst we're doing that replacement, we should make sure we don't make anything worse, which is really the key message here. And some things did not go as expected. So we've got a few stories, and the actual stories themselves aren't that important, but just trying to get people thinking a bit in these kind of environments, why do decisions get made like this, and just to think about how you could have potentially made the decision differently rather than telling you, yeah, in 20 minutes we are not going to tell you how to build a great open banking ecosystem. So one problem we saw early on in the UK and European Union, they insisted that all the banks have sandboxes. In theory, this sounds like a great thing because you've got a load of fintechs implementing with you, so you give them a sandbox where they get test accounts, real data, they can play against that without having to actually hit your production systems or use their own bank accounts as actually tests, because obviously no bank will actually give you a test account for their production systems, so the developers end up using their personal accounts. So sandboxes were in theory a great alternative to that. In practice, not so much. The sandboxes were required by law to match the production systems. I think of the, 40, 50, probably hundreds of sandboxes I've potentially seen now, I've seen exactly one that was pretty close to production. The rest, not even the same tech stack, let alone anything else. So no one used the sandboxes, so the banks gave up caring about the sandboxes. Not that they really cared that much to start with, and that's just a vicious cycle where sandboxes are now essentially irrelevant. So I don't know what motto you want to take away from that, but probably something along the lines of if the regulators don't actually do the enforcement to make sure that the sandboxes match production, then if you're not going to do that enforcement, just don't bother. Banks aren't going to do something unless you're actually really going to sit down and make them.
Back on sandboxes, just a comment. I think the reason why sandboxes were discussed and introduced is to solve implementation problem. And an example from Australia, we had an industry testing environment before we went live in 2020, which was extremely useful, especially in the absence of full coverage automated conformance testing. So there's a range of standards that you need to support. Everyone interprets those standards quite differently. If you don't have conformance testing, that we didn't have at the time, in Australia, industry testing environment was absolutely useful. We didn't have sandboxes, but at least we had environment. that industry testing environment was disconnected later on, which created additional problems. But there is a real problem, implementation problem. It's super useful to have an environment to be able to test your implementation from both sides.
Yeah, great point, Dima. So yeah, per bank sandboxes suck. An ecosystem-wide sandbox, absolutely, totally necessary. So another thing went wrong in the UK and in the EU actually. The lawyers put this great thing into law where they decided that, hey, users are going to be sharing access to this data. We should put the users in control. And to put the users in control, we're going to make sure that every 90 days they have to go to the bank and say, yes, I still want to continue sharing this data. In theory, great. It's there to protect your users. In practice, what happens at about the 90-day point? The fintechs lose most of their users because they never jump through the hoops to do the re-authentication at the bank. And this has been recognised by the regulators now. The UK have already relaxed it so that technically the user still needs to reconsent every 90 days, but the consent can now be done at the actual service they're using instead of having to log into their bank account to do it. And the EU has made the more, what would be the word? Probably less inspired decision of just changing the 90 days to 180 days, which doesn't really solve the root problem. It just moves the point at which your users drop off from 90 days to 180 days, which still doesn't get your users using your services for years.
But the intent was great. The intent of these 90-day rules is to make sure the customer is sort of forced to review their consent, that third party still has rightful access to their accounts. I've set up multiple consents for testing purposes, and they're all alive in Australia. I think maximum amount third party can ask consent for is 360 days. So the intent is good, but the implementation has implications for all participants.
So we'll talk about another UK use case, which was what the regulator called sweeping. So they had this great idea that the biggest 9 banks, there was some abuse of the market going on, and they decided that they wanted to allow users to more easily hold funds at alternative savings accounts, and the funds to just move backwards and forwards as the balance in the user's main current account is either too high or too low, just automatic transfers to and from savings. So this was all originally part of the original UK open banking order made in 2017. Just required it for the largest 9 banks, again, just because the sector didn't have effective competition, and that was one of the ways they thought they could break up some of that monopoly of the biggest, what's the word for a monopoly that's 9 players? I can't remember, but yeah, thank you. But this became highly political because the APIs that you would use to do this kind of thing, they don't support this use case unless you're very careful. And so it became highly political because it could really have decimated banks' card freeing. I've got the wrong word on that slide. Card fee income. So the fees that banks were getting from credit and debit card could easily have been just decimated by these kind of APIs. And it took until 2021 for the regulator to actually step in and clarify exactly what they meant and what the rules were around this. So, yeah, something the regulator thought was absolutely essential, but it took them 4 years to actually figure out exactly what the bank should do and to tell the banks that, yes, they really did have to do it. And this only started going live earlier this year. And it's still not really working. So yeah, we're now 6 years on from when the regulator originally said this was really essential, and it's just about working. So I think, yeah, the motto here is really, if the regulators want something to happen, then they do actually need to get in the middle and interact and see what's going on and head it off early if the banks aren't actually playing the ball. Otherwise it runs for 6 years before it actually happens. Another issue we had in the UK was that screen scraping, the main thing people were using it for was account aggregation. So everybody assumed, yeah, open banking is just going to replace screen scraping for account aggregation. That's not really what happened, and account aggregation has never actually been a great use case in the UK on open banking. And there's all sorts of reasons for this, so that in the UK they never made the smaller banks actually do any kind of certification or testing to prove that they met the standards. So that means that the account aggregators for each of these small banks they integrate with, they have to work around and test and do a whole bunch of things to cope with that particular bank's interpretation of the standards. Because, I mean, anybody that has done any kind of certification will know if you don't actually run the tests, banks will quite happily claim they're compliant, but they never are. And the UK and the EU also made this weird mistake where they managed to define the legal rules for the system such that some savings accounts were in scope and some were out of scope. So that really confuses users, because it's like, hey, I can see one of my savings account on this app, but I can't see the other one at exactly the same bank. And I'm sure the regulators at the time had great reasons why they thought this was great, but the end result was it just confused users.
To the point that we made in a previous presentation, that different jurisdictions implemented open banking differently. This long tail problem is one of the areas that doesn't actually done well in Australia, because all banks are compliant or mandated to support open banking, and all accounts are in scope. So it's a complete customer data out. So that's where the mandated bit, it actually helps on the supply side of the ecosystem.
I mean, another thing that people thought open banking was actually going to help was kind of running small business payroll. Small business owner myself, when it comes to run payroll, we have to manually copy the payment amounts from the payroll provider's spreadsheet, put them into the mobile banking app and manually enter the amounts and schedule the payments. It's not a good process, it's error prone. You would think having payments APIs would have avoided that, but it hasn't. And that seems to be mostly down to the liability model and the costs, because at least in the UK, there's a pretty high bar to actually getting access to the payment APIs, and it requires the person calling the APIs to take on a lot of liability, to have particular insurance cover in place, and nobody just seems to have made the business case for actually making this work for the small business case, which is a real shame, because payroll's an important thing. Employees get unhappy if you forget to type a digit on the end of the payment they're getting that month. So let's talk a bit about Europe. So obviously, at the point we started all this, the UK was part of the EU, and the PSD2 regulations in Europe were what drove some of open banking in both the UK and Europe. But the thing the UK said was, we are going to have a common API standard, and we're going to make all banks, and there are some nuances to this that Ralph will tell you about in great detail if you ask him after, but they did essentially require the banks to have common API and security standards, whereas the EU just said, hey, you banks need to have APIs, but you decide what APIs you need and exactly what the endpoint should be called and what data should be returned from each endpoint and so on. And that didn't go well, basically. The ecosystem in Europe is much smaller and much less mature than it is in the UK. And they're now talking about fixing it with PSD3, Payment Services Directive 3. So we'll see how they do this time around. They at least recognise the problem. So let's talk a little bit about Brazil then, and about testing and certification. And I'm going to pick on Gru from Despicable Me. Do like this meme. So what Brazil did, they allowed, or in fact required, banks to test and certify pre-production systems. And there were various reasons for this. Obviously the concern is, if you do that, then because you've certified a pre-production system, what's going to happen? Is production going to work? So the approach they decided to take was, hey, like, let's get an executive at the bank to sign a statement saying our production system is identical to the pre-production system that we tested and certified. And the outcome production systems did not work because they didn't actually match. Sorry, was that a question? Well, yes, that's a slightly separate issue. And the Brazil regulator is quite good, as I say. They did have good reasons for not testing in production at the time, but the regulator saw the issue, they reacted. They're now running automated tests against the production systems of all the banks. And that's working really well. They are actually making the banks fix production, and it is getting there now. And with my OpenID Foundation hat on, we've had this conversation with so many open banking ecosystems, and we always say that you need to test the production systems, because if you don't test the production systems, they're not going to work. And sometimes they listen to us and sometimes they don't, but the end result is always the same, that eventually they are going to end up testing in production if they want the stuff to work.
So I'll briefly go through, I don't know how much time we have, probably not that much, briefly go through the Australian story. I know Ralph asked me to be positive, but unfortunately, Australian implementation is not there yet. There are a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the reasons that Australia picked a pure redirect flow, web redirect flow, and doesn't support natively mobile apps. Most of the people in Australia use mobile app on their phone to interact with their bank, but when they have to do open banking, they get redirected to the web page where they have to put username and password that they haven't used for the last year, and that creates friction for everyone. The standards some of the standards were even the legislation was too prescriptive. Going to the point where they mandated OTP, and even if you have FIDO and stronger methods of authentication, you still have to generate OTP, things like that. I'll quickly jump to another slide. One of the probably personal passion problems for me is the fine-grained consent, or lack of it in Australia. So we started off with a coarse-grained consent, which created a massive privacy problem for me. So the third party can request your transaction data. There is no way this data can be limited to certain time or certain type of transaction. So essentially you're relying on the third party. As a customer, you're relying on a third party to ask only, to actually store and use only a subset of data while they have access to all of your data, all of your transaction data. So they use sort of high-level clusters. So you're allowed to have transactions. So if the data provider provides 7 years worth of data, they have access to 7 years worth of your transactions, even if they need last 24 hours. There is no way to constrain it through the ecosystem. So that's created a fundamental problem for some of the future requirements to be implemented apart from the privacy, and impacts trust in the ecosystem. We've touched on it in a previous presentation. Once again, it's important for open banking ecosystem to provide enough functionality to make it useful for third parties, to make it useful for customers. Payments is one of those critical functionalities that Australia is missing at the moment. I've touched on before that the mandate to all banks and all data, and in the future all energy providers and telcos, is great from a supply side, but it's only beginning. Back to the expectations from different parties, users don't have, as a result, enough use cases or appealing use cases. We're still waiting for a killer use case to come through. It's expensive for third parties to join the ecosystem, and it's absolutely expensive for the banks to maintain open banking, even implement. Initial implementation, we're talking about billions of dollars in the industry spend on open banking collectively. And you've seen in a previous presentation, the number of transactions is very, very low.
So let's very quickly talk about some things that went well, because we're going to run out of time soon. turns out that actually enabling payments is one thing that really drives user traffic through this. So in the UK, we had a great use case with charities, a company called Just Giving. They already had 85% of their traffic on mobile and tablets. They enabled open banking to make donations to charities. They reckoned it saved 50% of the fees compared to card donations, and it also massively reduced fraud. Why people defraud charities is a whole separate thing, and it also got quicker cash flow for the charities as well. So this wasn't anything people said, oh, we'll do open banking because it will improve stuff for charities, but this is one of the outcomes when you do things well, is you get unexpected outcomes, or good unexpected outcomes. Another example was paying your taxes. Again, this was a really great ecosystem. The government did a project, one of the most successful government IT projects ever in terms of delivering massive savings pretty quickly. And another one that the UK and EU ecosystems both got right is that many users just bank with mobile apps these days. It's really essential that the open banking has to be supported in the mobile app as well, so that users can just authorize API access or the open banking access in exactly the same way as when they're using their bank account on their mobile device. This uses a thing called app-to-app, which we did a session about a few years ago. And let's jump onto our takeaways. So there's so many open banking ecosystems. They're already live, they're delivering benefits. Hopefully we'll get them in the US eventually. Good user experience is really the key to acceptance and growth. Without the good user experience, you're not going to get users actually using the system, so people won't build around it and so on. Just learn from other ecosystems. There's so many examples out there now of what good looks like. You don't have to do much from first principles these days. You look at other ecosystems, what's good, and copy the bits you like, basically. Regulation is a really good thing for open banking ecosystems in general, because the ecosystems that don't have regulation are way behind the ones I've mentioned today. But as you saw from many of the examples, the regulation, it has to be thoughtful and it really has to be responsive. You do not write an open banking regulation and then your job is done as a regulator. This is an iterative process, and if you want it to work well, you have to be really responsive. And it is really difficult to balance the feedback from users, fintechs, banks and politicians, all of which have competing and opposing goals for this thing. So that most of these problems that we talked about that arise were because one of those groups got more influence than they should have on the outcomes, and that's where the regulators really have to be switched on.
I think the main takeaway for me, I think that's probably the third point. Learn from others and keep in mind why open banking has been started, what were the objectives for each of the participating parties, fintech, regulator, consumer, and the banks.
So great. Thank you, everyone. We don't have time for questions, I'm afraid, because we have